January 4, 2022. East Point, Michigan. A 17-year-old girl leaves home to spend time with her cousin. Hours later, she's gone. No calls, no messages, no answers. What begins as a search for a missing teen soon uncovers a betrayal so cruel, it leaves a family shattered and a community in disbelief. This is the story of Jaylin Foster. Jaylin was a bright, ambitious young woman with her whole life ahead of her. But in one single day, someone she trusted deeply took all of that away. A family who believed in the power of love and loyalty was forced to confront the dark truth hidden in their own circle. What could drive someone to harm a person they claimed to care for? How could such darkness exist so close to home? And what led investigators to the chilling discovery that would finally reveal the truth? In this video, we'll uncover how Jaylin's cousin used trust as a weapon, the evidence that unraveled his carefully constructed lies, and the devastating courtroom moments that left everyone speechless. Stay with us as we explore the shocking details of Jaylin Foster's tragic story and the justice her family fought so hard to achieve. Jaylin Foster was just 17 years old, full of energy, ambition, and promise. A high school student with dreams of becoming an entrepreneur, she was known for her bright smile that could light up any room. Her family described her as a compassionate and loving young woman who cared deeply for those around her. Jaylin had a way of making everyone feel seen and valued, a quality her mother, grandmother, and siblings often mentioned when talking about her. Her mother once said, "Jaylin was our light. She dreamed big and worked hard. She loved her family and was always the first to step up when someone needed her." Jaylin's optimism and resilience inspired everyone who knew her. To her family, she wasn't just a daughter, a sister, or a niece, she was their joy, their hope for the future. Her bond with her family was unshakable. She spent her free time helping her mother with household tasks, mentoring her younger siblings, and planning a future where she could give back to her loved ones. Jaylin's sense of responsibility was well beyond her years, but she never let the weight of expectations dull her fun-loving spirit. Friends described her as someone who always found time to laugh, even when the days were tough. Her life was on a path of purpose and positivity. And among the many family relationships she cherished, there was her cousin, a 23-year-old man she had known all her life. Like many families, they were close, sharing meals, laughs, and family traditions. Jaylin trusted him, as any young woman would trust a relative she had grown up with. Their bond seemed natural, even comforting, a relationship built on years of shared experiences. But while Jaylin saw him as an older cousin she could trust, there were signs, subtle and quiet, that he saw her differently. Those closest to the family recalled how he would often make excuses to be near Jaylin, offering to pick her up or drop her off, even when it wasn't necessary. He would linger in conversations, paying her a level of attention that some thought seemed unusual for a cousin. His outward behavior was always cloaked in what seemed like care and concern, but beneath that surface lay an unhealthy obsession that he kept hidden. The family never questioned his intentions, never imagined that he could be anything other than a protective older relative. Jaylin herself had no reason to fear him, until the day she disappeared. The trust the family placed in him would soon prove to be misplaced, but by the time they realized, it was far too late. On January 4, 2022, Jaylin Foster was at home in East Point, Michigan, where she lived with her mother and siblings. It was a normal evening, nothing out of the ordinary. At some point, Jaylin received a message from her cousin, Jaylin Brazier. He invited her to spend time with him, a request that wouldn't have raised any alarms. After all, this was someone the family had known and trusted for years. Jaylin's mother, concerned as any parent would be, asked her to confirm her plans. Zion assured her mother it was just her cousin. There was no hesitation, no second-guessing, this was family. She left the house that evening, telling her mother she wouldn't be gone for long. She didn't take much with her, just her phone and the clothes she was wearing. For Zion, it was just another evening. For her family, it was the last time they would see her alive. As the hours passed, Zion's family noticed the silence. She hadn't called or texted to update them. Initially, they tried not to panic. Maybe she was just caught up in conversation or had lost track of time. But as the night stretched on, worry began to set in. Calls to her phone went unanswered, and messages weren't returned. The next morning, her mother reached out to Jaylin. He told her Zion had left his house the night before, claiming he had dropped her off near her home. It sounded plausible, but there was something in his tone, calm, almost too calm, that left her uneasy. Still, she wanted to believe him. After all, he was family, someone they had always trusted. In the days leading up to Zion's disappearance, there were signs that something wasn't quite right, though no one could have predicted how events would unfold. Family members later recalled how Jaylin had become increasingly possessive around Zion. He would often insist on driving her places, even when she didn't need a ride. His interest in her seemed to go beyond the boundaries of a typical cousin relationship. There were moments when his behavior raised quiet questions, but they were easy to dismiss. After all, he was family. Zion's mother, reflecting on those moments, said, "We never thought anything of it. He was her cousin. We trusted him." That trust would soon be betrayed in the most devastating way. Zion's mother and the rest of the family grew increasingly desperate. They called friends, searched local hangouts, and begged for information. Jaylin maintained his story, he had dropped her off, and that was the last he saw of her. But even as he repeated this, cracks in his demeanor began to show. He avoided eye contact and kept his answers short, as though he wanted to end the conversation as quickly as possible. Little did Zion's family know, the truth was far worse than anything they could have imagined. What seemed like a typical visit to her cousin's house was the beginning of a nightmare that would haunt them forever. As the days passed with no sign of Zion, her family's worry turned into despair. Law enforcement became involved, and what began as a missing persons case quickly took a darker turn. Investigators began retracing Zion's steps, starting with her last known location, her cousin Jaylin Brazier's home. When questioned, Jaylin repeated the same story, that he had dropped her off near her house late that evening. At first, his calm demeanor seemed convincing, but as detectives began digging deeper, inconsistencies began to emerge. Phone records became a critical piece of evidence. Investigators discovered that Zion's phone had last pinged near Jaylin's house, and there were no signs of movement afterward. This raised immediate red flags. The timeline Jaylin provided didn't match the data, and his story began to unravel. Then came the texts, messages exchanged between Jaylin and Zion in the days leading up to her disappearance. These texts painted a troubling picture. Jaylin had been expressing feelings that went far beyond familial affection. He sent messages that were persistent, insistent, and at times, overbearing. When Zion didn't respond in the way he wanted, his frustration was evident. The obsession that had been simmering beneath the surface was becoming harder to ignore. The events of that night slowly came into focus. It became clear that Zion had trusted her cousin, someone she had known her entire life, only to walk into a situation she could never have anticipated. Jaylin's obsession with her had grown to the point where he could no longer contain it. Investigators believe that at some point during the evening, Zion rejected his advances, just as she had in the past. But this time, his obsession turned to rage. In that moment, the person Zion trusted became the one who ended her life. The details of what happened next are both chilling and heartbreaking. Out of respect for Zion and her family, we won't delve into the specifics of the violence that occurred, but what we do know is that Jaylin acted deliberately, with no regard for the life he was taking or the pain he would cause. After the crime, Jaylin's actions became calculated. Instead of calling for help or notifying the family, he set about covering his tracks. He deleted incriminating messages from his phone, attempting to erase any trace of the disturbing exchanges he had with Zion. He discarded evidence and even tried to mislead investigators about his whereabouts. Perhaps the most disturbing part of his cover-up was the way he continued to interact with Zion's family. Jaylin stood alongside them during the initial search efforts, pretending to share their pain and confusion. He offered words of comfort, feigning concern, all while knowing exactly what had happened to Zion. His ability to deceive those closest to him added another layer of betrayal to an already horrific act. But the truth was catching up to him. Investigators pressed harder, uncovering more discrepancies in his story. Witnesses began to step forward, offering information that contradicted Jaylin's version of events. The mounting evidence left him with nowhere to turn. Eventually, Jaylin confessed, admitting to what he had done. The person Zion's family thought they could trust had been the one to take her from them in the most unimaginable way. When Zion Foster failed to return home, her family's concern turned into immediate action. Her mother, heartbroken and desperate for answers, began reaching out to friends and family, hoping someone might know where she was. Calls went out late into the night, and as the hours stretched on, worry turned into dread. The community in East Point rallied behind Zion's family. Flyers with her photo were printed and distributed across town, plastered on telephone poles and pinned to bulletin boards in local stores. Social media became a vital tool, as posts about Zion's disappearance were shared widely, spreading her image far and wide. Friends and neighbors joined search parties, walking through nearby parks, wooded areas, and abandoned lots, hoping to find any sign of the missing teen. Her mother pleaded with the public, her voice trembling with emotion. She spoke directly to the cameras, saying, "Zion, if you're out there and you can hear this, we love you. Please come home. We just want you safe." The pain in her voice was palpable, resonating with everyone who heard her. As the days turned into weeks, the family grew increasingly frustrated. They were doing everything they could, but there was no sign of Zion. It was then that law enforcement began to shift their focus. They started to look closely at the last person to see her alive, her cousin, Jaylin Brazier. Initially, Jaylin maintained his innocence. He claimed he had spent time with Zion, dropped her off near her home, and hadn't seen her since. But his calm and collected demeanor began to crack under scrutiny. Detectives noted discrepancies in his timeline. His story changed subtly each time he told it, small inconsistencies that suggested he wasn't being entirely truthful. Then came the first major breakthrough. Investigators subpoenaed phone records from both Zion and Jaylin. Zion's phone had last pinged near Jaylin's home late on the night of her disappearance, contradicting his claim that he had dropped her off elsewhere. What's more, Zion's phone showed no activity after that night, no calls, no texts, nothing. This raised a red flag and shifted the investigation's focus squarely onto Jaylin. The phone records were damning enough, but what they revealed next made Jaylin's motives even clearer. Text messages between Jaylin and Zion painted a picture of a man who was fixated on her. His messages were persistent and, at times, possessive. They showed a pattern of obsession that Zion herself seemed to recognize. Some messages suggested that Zion had been trying to distance herself, responding less frequently and keeping the tone neutral. Detectives presented this evidence to Jaylin during an interrogation. Confronted with the phone records, the text messages, and the inconsistencies in his story, Jaylin began to falter. His calm exterior gave way to nervous tics, his hands fidgeted, his voice quivered, and he avoided making eye contact. When detectives pressed further, Jaylin eventually admitted to the truth. He confessed to taking Zion's life and described how he had tried to cover his tracks. His words were cold, devoid of remorse, leaving investigators stunned at the calculated way he had betrayed someone who trusted him so completely. Jaylin's confession was a major breakthrough, but it brought little solace to Zion's grieving family. The man they had trusted, someone they had shared meals with and welcomed into their home, was the very person responsible for taking her life. For the detectives, the case was far from over. They still had to locate Zion's remains and piece together the full story of what had happened that night. As the details of Jaylin's confession began to emerge, so did the horrifying reality of what Zion had endured. Her family, now armed with the truth, prepared themselves for the next chapter, the courtroom. But what came next in the courtroom was something no one could have prepared for. The courtroom was packed on the day Jaylin Brazier faced the judge for his crimes. Zion Foster's family filled the seats, their faces a mix of grief and determination. This was their moment to seek justice for Zion, to confront the man who had taken her from them. Jaylin's defense attempted to frame the events as impulsive rather than premeditated. His attorney argued that his actions were the result of a moment of poor judgment, claiming he never intended for things to escalate the way they did. But the evidence spoke louder than any words. The text messages, phone records, and his eventual confession painted a clear picture of obsession in deliberate actions. The prosecution emphasized the betrayal at the heart of the case. They highlighted how Jaylin had exploited Zion's trust and how his calculated efforts to cover his tracks showed intent and awareness of his actions. The jury listened intently, their faces reflecting the weight of the evidence being presented. The most emotional moments of the trial came during the testimonies from Zion's family. Her mother took the stand, her voice steady but filled with pain. She spoke of Zion's kindness, her ambitions, and the light she brought to their lives. Looking directly at Jaylin, she said, "We trusted him. He was family. And he took away someone we loved dearly." Her words echoed through the courtroom, leaving a palpable silence. Other family members also shared their memories of Zion, painting a vivid picture of the life that had been stolen. They spoke of her dreams of becoming an entrepreneur, her love for her siblings, and the laughter she brought into their home. Each testimony reinforced the depth of the loss and the impact Jaylin's actions had on their family. One of the most shocking moments of the trial came when additional evidence was presented, revealing the extent of Jaylin's attempts to mislead both the family and investigators. Details emerged about how he had participated in the search for Zion, standing side by side with her grieving mother while knowing exactly what had happened. This revelation drew gasps from those in attendance, further highlighting the calculated nature of his actions. As the trial progressed, it became increasingly clear that Jaylin had not only taken Zion's life but also inflicted unimaginable pain on her family by pretending to support them in their search. The betrayal was deep and irrevocable. When the moment of sentencing finally arrived, the courtroom was silent. The judge addressed Jaylin directly, condemning his actions and the pain he had caused. He was sentenced to time in prison for his role in Zion's death, a punishment that brought some measure of accountability but could never undo the harm done. As the sentence was read, Zion's family held each other tightly. Tears flowed freely, a mix of grief and relief that justice, in some form, had been served. Outside the courtroom, her mother spoke to reporters, her voice trembling as she said, "We'll never get Zion back, but we'll keep her memory alive. She deserved so much more than this." The trial ended, but the pain remained. For Zion's family, the fight for justice was over, but their journey to heal was just beginning. Zion Foster's name is now a symbol of love, resilience, and the unbreakable bond of family, even in the face of unimaginable tragedy. Her family speaks of her often, remembering her as a beacon of light in their lives. They recall her infectious laughter, her compassion, and the dreams she held so tightly. Zion wanted to build a future where she could support and uplift those around her, and it is this vision that continues to inspire her loved ones. Her mother, in particular, has become a voice for change. Speaking publicly about Zion's story, she urges other families to pay closer attention to warning signs, even within trusted relationships. She has expressed her hope that no other family will have to endure the kind of pain and betrayal that theirs has. "We couldn't save Zion," she said in one interview, "but maybe her story can save someone else." This tragedy also sent ripples through the East Point community and beyond. For many, it was a wake-up call, a reminder that trust must be balanced with vigilance, even among those closest to us. Zion's story has inspired conversations about the importance of setting boundaries and recognizing the signs of obsessive or unhealthy behavior. In her honor, local organizations have held events aimed at raising awareness about domestic violence and familial abuse. Community leaders have used this tragedy to highlight the need for open communication within families, encouraging people to speak up when something feels wrong. The hope is that Zion's legacy will not only be one of love but also of change. The story of Zion Foster is a heartbreaking reminder that danger can sometimes come from those we trust the most. It teaches us the importance of vigilance, the value of listening to our instincts, and the need to protect the ones we love at all costs. While Zion's life was cut tragically short, her memory continues to inspire her family, her community, and those who hear her story. Her family has vowed to honor her by living with the same love and kindness she embodied. Zion may no longer be here, but the impact of her life and the lessons from her story will never fade. The story of Zion Foster is one that leaves us with difficult questions about trust, awareness, and the warning signs that may go unnoticed until it's too late. It's a tragedy that reminds us of the importance of having open conversations with loved ones and paying attention to the behaviors of those around us, even those we hold dear. What do you think could have been done to prevent this tragedy? Were there steps that might have saved Zion's life? Let us know your thoughts in the comments below. Your voice matters, and together, we can continue the conversation about how to protect others from suffering a similar fate. If this story shocked you or gave you insight into the complexities of trust and betrayal, please take a moment to like this video, share it with others, and subscribe to our channel. Your support helps us tell these important stories and raise awareness about the dangers lurking closer than we often realize. And don't forget to turn on notifications so you never miss another gripping true crime story. In our next video, we'll explore another case that will leave you questioning everything you thought you knew about trust and loyalty. It's a story that will shed light on yet another heartbreaking crime and the pursuit of justice that followed. Stay tuned, and as always, thank you for joining us as we bring these important stories to light.